This session is the logic model. The logic model is being requested of um, people submitting proposals left and right now. And if used properly, that it's a very good, very useful tool. Um, but basically, the logic model is really just a graphic roadmap for funders to use in order to determine whether or not, the proposal, number one, makes sense, and number two, hits the marks. So we're going to jump right in. Welcome, everybody. So yeah, the logic model is a visual depiction of a program. In essence, that's what it comes down to. But today we're going to talk about, what is a logic model, what are the basic elements of a logic model, and how funders use the logic models in the grant review process. Because let's just keep it real. Um, it appears to be complex, but because it's becoming more and more requested, we want to know what it is that the funder is looking for. For those of you joining for the first time, my name is Amber Wynn, and I've had the honor and pleasure of providing these 90-minute workshops to the Latino Coalition. I have 30 years in the nonprofit sector. I've done everything from emptying the trash to giving out $7 million annually as a funder. I've been a grant writer, my largest grant, $3.2 million. And so I take that information to provide insights to topics that, we as nonprofit leaders don't typically have access to. So feel free to ask your questions during the presentation. Feel free to ask whatever, because like I said, I have varying viewpoints. Sometimes they conflict. I have been an executive director, and as an executive director, my position with funders sometimes conflict because, sometimes the funder just doesn't dial in the way that we do as executive directors. But it's important to know the funder's perspective so that you can create more competitive proposals. So I'm excited to be able to provide those type of insights. But when we talk about the logic model, the purpose of a logic model is to help increase the likelihood that program efforts will be successful. Why? Because they communicate the purpose of the program and expected results. It helps to describe the actions expected to lead to desired results. The logic model becomes a reference point for everyone involved in the program. That's probably one of the most useful purposes, I think. Having been a grant writer, especially when you have different stakeholders, you've got collaborators, you've got administrators, you've got people on the ground. When you have a logic model, you're able to use it to keep everybody on point. It also improves the program staff's expertise in planning, implementing, and evaluating the program. When you have people talking about something, it's left up for interpretation. But when you have a one-page graphic that says, here are inputs, here are outputs, everybody is able to be on the same page. And the more that your program staff can refer to the logic model, then the more expertise they tend to create around that. As I said before, if it involves stakeholders, it enhances the likelihood of resource commitment because it's already allocated, it's there in black and white. And you can use findings from other research and demonstration projects to help strengthen what it is that you're doing. Identify potential obstacles to program operations so that staff can address them early on. When you have something visual versus something conceptual, if you put it in front of a subject matter expert, they're going to say, hey, you missed a step, or hey, are you sure about that? Because if this happens, then that happens, then we may miss something. So a logic model really, really helps in the implementation process with identifying gaps before they are even encountered. So there is a history to the logic model that I think it's really important, because when you understand how it evolved, then you understand the purpose, right? So they actually started back in the 1970s as an evaluation by Joseph Woolley, and he was focusing on cooperative extension. If you are familiar with the UC system, the universities are based in research, but then they use the UC cooperative extensions to then take that research and incorporate it into communities. So that's when it really got surfaced, right around 1979, the cooperative agreements. But the private sector has experienced an influx in using logic models. They call it total quality management and performance measurement. And again, it's based on evaluation. The public sector jumped into it around 1993 when the federal agencies moved to focus on results and then link investments to results. And that was more around like the value of our taxpayer dollars, like what's going on with our taxpayer dollars. And so then they shifted so where they could be able to say, this is what we invested and this is, what has come out as a result. So when you see the president or when you see your elected official saying, employment has dropped by 33%. This is how they've been able to do that. They use logic models, they use the graphics to be able to explain how things are not only invested, but then the results using taxpayer dollars. And then, of course, the nonprofit sector. I say this all the time. In the 90s, when life was great and money flowed with ease, around 2000 is when we started as a nonprofit sector to be impacted. And funders, it started primarily with government grants. We're like, hey, we want you to start using this thing called the logic model. I started to see them around 2014, 15, when I was in academia, when I was at Cal State Fullerton. The government always asked the faculty, please provide a logic model. In the early 2000s, they were doing things like, show us your program evaluation, show us, but what happens is, in a lot of academia, you have people coming from different parts of the country. So what they were experiencing was challenges with the language, right? And so they're like, what can we do to help our evaluators understand what it is that these brilliant faculty members are trying to say? And so around 2014, 15 is when we really started getting the requests from faculty to start doing more logic models. And then subsequently, it came to the nonprofit sector. It's been something that's definitely been used internationally because, as you know, there's a lot of preconceived notions about corruption and things of that nature. So the aid that goes out internationally, again, needs to be quantified to make sure that the investment is demonstrating a positive return. So logic models help funders to really say, okay, what is it that you're doing? And how do we know if it's successful? At the end of the day, a logic model is an evaluation framework. Evaluators have really played a prominent role in developing the logic model. The logic model go back to Schumann and Weiss in 1972, Bennett's hierarchy of evidence to evaluate effectiveness. Remember I said again about the extension programs, and then Holy was the evaluability techniques developed to determine if a program is even ready for evaluation. So it got to the point where when they were looking at these submissions and programs, they were like, okay, first of all, the goals and objectives were vague. And we see that a lot in the nonprofit sector. Why? Because we are direct service providers. We're not researchers. And so there's a tendency for our goals and our objectives to either be vague or mixed up. And you're like, this is not a goal, this is an objective, right? The programs didn't exist or they weren't being implemented in a way that would achieve expected results. As funders, that is what we experience. It's like, okay, so you're delivering the programs, but how do we know as a funder writing the check that we're going to get the results that you're promising? So that's what happened, right? They were like, okay, we need a different way to evaluate that. And then that's when Bickman and Chin created this theory-driven evaluation. And then Weiss came in, tightened it up, and now you've got this theory-based evaluation. But at the end of the day, the logic model is really just a broad array of theoretical and practical applications with the goal of being able to say to a funder, here's what we're putting in, here's what you should expect to get out. So let's just jump into what a logic model is. There are many definitions. It's a graphic illustration of the relationship between the program's resources, activities, and its intended effect. It clearly and concisely shows how the interventions affect behavior and achieve a goal. It's a hypothesized description of the chain of causes and effects leading to an outcome. But at the end of the day, it is a framework for planning, implementation, and evaluation that links the investments to results. That's the funder's perspective. The first three are probably the collaborators and the nonprofit's perspective, right? It's a way for us to illustrate how the relationships between our resources, activities, and effects come together. Before a funder, it's just a graphic picture of how to plan, implement, and evaluate our investments. So as I said before, usually logic models are a part of an evaluation. But if you are a researcher, then perhaps, the logic model is just the first step to helping everybody who's involved understand what this program is going to look like. You've got, your outside stakeholders. As a nonprofit, it could be like, okay, you've got your workforce investment people, then you've got your, recovery people. You've got all of these different players. But if you put together a logic model, you can say to each one of them here, and here's where you fit in, and here's the overarching goal of this program. But for the funders, it's a part of the RFP process. They ask you to provide them with a logic model. As a reviewer, and I can tell you, having sat on a review panel, most of the time when people know what a logic model is and the elements and what it's supposed to be, it helps the reviewer to understand more clearly what your program is. And that is helpful during the review process, because sometimes you're writing, when you're writing grants, 12 o'clock in the morning before it's due, it's not always clear. But if you have that logic model as a reviewer and you're like, oh, okay, so this goes here and then this happens, okay, got it. So it usually is helpful unless you don't prepare the logic model correctly. If you don't prepare the logic model correctly, then it's not going to be helpful for the review panel. But again, it's like when you're writing, there are different writing levels, and it's just unclear. Because as you know, a part of that is the funder's problem. They will ask you the same question 4 times and you thinking, well, maybe I need to change the answer, And so we're like, well, what happened? She said over here this, and then here that. But with the logic model, it goes straight across. And it simplifies the explanation of the problem, the intervention, the results, and the impact. I am going to, when I finish with this page, I want you to take a screenshot of it because it is your cheat sheet. This is going to explain every element of the logic model. You have inputs. Inputs are the resources, whether it's the dollars, the staff, the materials that goes into the program or intervention. So the inputs are what you invest, right? Then the activities are the events that happen in the program, right? Or the partners that are going to produce the desired outcomes. And that's what we do. The outputs are the direct and tangible results of activities. So that's what you get. And then the outcomes are the results of the program. And that's what we achieve. The short-term outcomes are the immediate effects of the programs or the interventions. And the intermediate outcomes are the effects that happen like somewhere in the middle of the project. But the long-term outcomes are the overall desired program results. So take a screenshot of this, because when you are building your logic model and you're like, wait a minute, what is this section for? This is your guide. What we invest, what we do, what we get, what we achieve, the immediate effects, the middles, midterm effects, and then the overall program results. It seems simple when it's in written form, but wait until you get to the graphic. So this is the basic elements of a logic model. You've got, what's the situation? I call it the problem. Like, what are your priorities? What are you focusing on? Then you have your inputs, your outputs, which are your activities, and then like who's all involved, right? Then you have your outcomes and your impacts, your short term, medium term, long term. At the bottom, you have your assumptions. Your assumptions are, if we have these activities and we do these things, then this is what should happen. And then you have your external factors, things that you can't control. Like you may be doing drug intervention, but you can't control those external factors. You can't control the fact that this person is in an environment that is drug infested. Like you can't control that. So you have external factors that you acknowledge, but they're there and you can't control them. So this is a template for a logic model. And I want you to take a screenshot of it because I'm going to show you that there are a gazillion different ways that you can create a logic model. And then I'm going to explain to you why I think this one is the most effective. When it comes to a logic model, the way that I've been able to process it and make it make sense so where it's not complicated is by seeing it as a series of if-then statements, right? So in terms of your inputs, right? So you need certain resources in order to operate your program. So that's what you're going to put. We need funding, we need staff, we need, venues, right? If you have access to them, then you can use them to accomplish your planned activities, right? If you accomplish your planned activity, then you will deliver on the amount of services that you intend on. And if you accomplish your planned activities, right, then your participants will benefit. And if these benefits are achieved, then changes in the groups, the communities, or the environment will occur. This is the simplest way that I can explain the logic model, if then. And if you are trying to work with outside stakeholders, this is the easiest way to help them understand the purpose of your program. If we have this, then this will happen. And if this happens, then this will happen. And if this happens, then this will happen. And ultimately, we will see impact in our program. The first part is your planned work. And then the second part are your intended results. Does that make sense? Any questions so far? I will tell you that I have been through maybe 16, 17 logic models. I've had 25 consultants try to explain it to me. This is the best way that I have been able to understand the logic model and how to use it effectively. When an RFP says, submit a logic model, rarely do they give you a template. They just say, give us a logic model. So let me give you an example. When we say if then, it would look like this. You'd ask yourself, how can you complete the following sentence to describe your program? If we have blank and blank, then we can do blank and blank, which will then result in blank and blank. The first two blanks list the resources, the third and fourth blanks describe the activities, and the final two blanks describe the outputs of those activities. So it would read like this. If we have program funding in participating clinics, we can inform our clinic partners of the need to implement clinical practice guidelines and sponsor training for clinic teams on the chronic care model, which will then increase the number of clinic teams who are aware of clinical practice guidelines and who implement the chronic care model. Now, in the beginning of the pandemic, you could replace this with all types of things, right? If we have program funding in participating clinics, we can inform, if we have participating nonprofits or funders, we can inform our funders on the need to fund Black-led, brown-led nonprofits, right? and sponsor training on capacity building, which will then increase the number of nonprofits who are better able to serve the community. So you can transfer out anything. It's just the process of the if then. If you ask other questions, right, you can do the same thing with the rest of your short, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. If we educate clinic teams and train them in the chronic care model in clinics, then we will see blank, and blank will occur in the short term. Here's the example. If we educate clinic teams and train them in the chronic care model in clinics, we will see implementation of the chronic care model, resulting in appropriate treatment for patients with high blood pressure. And then if we continue with that, right, we can get to the intermediate outcomes. If clinics implement the chronic care model and have an increase in appropriate treatment for high blood pressure, then we will see X and Z. So if they use the chronic care model and increase the treatment for patients with high blood pressure, then we will see an increase in the number of patients with high blood pressure under control. And then lastly, for the long-term outcomes, if there's an increase in the number of current clinic patients whose high blood pressure is under control, then we should see a reduction in heart disease and stroke among the patients. So if we put in the training to the particular stakeholders and they do this new model, then our patients should reduce their symptoms, right? And then we should see overarching in our community, a reduction in heart disease and stroke among the patients. As a reviewer, we need it to be that simple, especially when you've got all of these activities and you've got all of these players. It's like, what is the bottom line? The bottom line is, if you give us money, here's what's going to happen. We're going to train these people on this new system. Once they're trained on this new system, then this different type of outcome will happen. And then this is how we change the community. Does that make sense? Any questions on that? This is I'm not gonna lie. When I learned this way, I got up and I did the happy. I'm like, it makes sense. It makes sense. This freaking logic model makes sense. When it was designed, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say that I was gonna affirm the same feeling. I feel like when I see examples and there's blanks, right, and like the blanks, and then see the example, that's everything. Like I learn in that context, so I really appreciate.
I do too. I'm very visual, and especially if I'm struggling with something, I try to overlay it, right? So if I am saying, okay, if you give me money to train, BIPOC leaders, like I can put mine in that if then sentence and then it makes sense. And I'm just going to say it. I think I'm pretty talented, you guys, but there's some moments when I'm like, Amber, what is wrong with you? So when I'm able to just crystallize something and it pops, I'm like, yes. And it's just the way. Yeah, it's just the way we process. Everybody processes different. I find that some people just get it right away. So I always say, well, it's Amber proof. And if it's Amber proof, then pretty much everybody else is going to get it because I struggle. So I get excited. I get excited when I have these types of templates and these types of supports that just help to crystallize it.
I was gonna ask, can we go back one slide just because I wanted to screenshot that? Yes, thank you.
No worries.
Awesome. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. So as it relates to what a logic would potentially look like, I'm going to tell you there are 15 different versions. You need to find one that's going to work for you. And once you find the logic model that works for you, stick with it. Stick with it. But generally speaking, we have to the left the inputs. You have funding, you have the clinic partners, then you have the activities, which are to educate the clinic teams And if you educate the clinic teams, then you will be able to provide training to them in the specific model. The outputs, right, are that the clinic teams are now educated about these guidelines, right? And then the outputs for providing training to the clinic teams is that they're now trained in this model. Then you move it forward. The short-term outcomes is an increase in appropriate treatment for high blood pressure, right? And then the clinic teams implement, which then gets you to your intermediate outcomes, which is an increase in the number of patients with high blood pressure under control. And then the long term is a decrease in the heart disease and stroke among the patients. I am showing you the visual model of the if-then statements. So this right here is visually laid out. This is your logic model in graphic form. But it's easier to put this together when you do the if-then statements because you see the flow. So take a screenshot of this, because when you're sitting down and you're going to say, what did Amber say? You take the if-thens, you write them out, and then you graphically put them together. So you see the arrows, they're all going to the right. And that's what you want. At the bottom, the assumption is that, you know, the clinic care, the chronic clinic care model changes are maintained by the clinics and the patients maintain blood pressure control. That's the assumption. But what are the factors that you can't control? Well, there's a prevalence of risk factors and hypertension is increasing. You can't control that. So here is the simple layout of a generic logic model. You've got the process and you've got the outcomes. You always are going to have the inputs, the activities, the outputs, short-term, intermediate, and long. That's one view. That's one sample. Here's another one. Logic model example. I'm showing you these because I get this question all the time. Well, which template should I use? A funder is rarely going to give you a template. They're just going to say, provide a logic model. This is simple, right? Inputs, activities, outputs, short-term, intermediate. So that you can see it doesn't have to have all the boxes. It just needs to make sense. Funding to support bus passes or extended clinic hours. The activities for that is that you're going to provide the incentives, is that you're going to extend the hours. Adequate staffing, support for management. So you just got to make sure that across the board, whatever your inputs are, there are activities that correlate. There are outputs that correlate. There are outcomes that correlate. That's the only thing that you have to make sure. So as a reviewer, I'm looking to see, well, what are the inputs? There are 3. What are the activities for those inputs? What are the outputs, the outcomes for short, immediate, and long term? You see here, they don't have assumptions. They don't have, you know, what's going on in the environment. This is the one that we use for Cal State Fullerton. The way that it's broken down is the short term, medium, and long term are all across the board. So you don't have to figure it out. You've got the problem statement, the inputs, the outputs, and the outcomes. And at the bottom, you have your assumptions and you have your environment. But it always flows to the right. You have another one. Here's what I want you to see as a reviewer. This is how we look at your logic model. Process, right? And the outcome. How would you, if you are working with a stakeholder, explain your program to your stakeholder? Let's just say you want to partner with another nonprofit who can do the work because they have expertise and you're going to do a subcontract with them. You would say, okay, here's what we're going to do. After you guys have determined what each partner is going to do, now you get to the evaluation part. And this is where a lot of our nonprofits are like, well, I don't know what I'm evaluating. Well, I'm not sure. Your logic model will help you with that. If you look at this graphic for the inputs, are the resources adequate to implement the program, right? Whatever it is that you're putting in, this is the question. After you guys have decided what your program is, you pull out this sheet and you say, all right, Now, in terms of evaluation, if we were to look at this from a funder's perspective, are the resources that we've allocated to this adequate to implement the program? And if so, what will be measured? In terms of the activities, is the program implemented as planned? What will be measured? For the outputs, how much was produced? What will be measured? So you just go through this with each section of the logic model, and it will help you to form your evaluation, right? Here's the evaluation part. Remember, the process is what you put in, and then on the outcomes is what is expected to come out. Short term, what is going to be evaluated? A change in knowledge, a change in policy, a change in behavior, a change in environment, right? For the intermediate outcomes, what is going to change? A change in system, right? Long term, a change in health status, and then in terms of the impacts, a change in population. So for the long term and beyond, we want to see big, broad changes. So you start off with the participant, and then the community, and then the environment, which is society as a whole. That's generally what we're expecting to see from the funder's perspective. Our immediate outcomes is that Amber is now going to be a more effective nonprofit leader because she's gone through these activities, right? And because Amber is an effective leader, now her nonprofit organization is going to be more effective. And because the nonprofit is more effective, we're going to see an impact in the community. And then in terms of impact, right, like that big scope, we should see a change in this population. That's it in a nutshell, right? What are you putting in? What are the activities, right? What's the change? What's the change? Small, medium, large, and then for society. But this page, if you take a screenshot of it, when you put the program together and you're talking to your stakeholders, this is how you get to the evaluation questions. And this is what it looks like. Your inputs, your activities, and your outputs, are they efficient? So you get to measure, this is what I'm putting in. Is it enough to get me to X, Y, and Z? This is what I'm putting in. Is it enough to get to the outputs? In terms of effectiveness, those short-term outcomes and those medium outcomes and long-term, like if Amber as a nonprofit leader increases in skill and knowledge, when we talk about causal attribution, what should happen, remember when we talk about the assumptions, what should happen is that her staff is going to increase in their knowledge and skill. And then what should happen, that causal attribution, is that you'll see an increase in services, and then you'll see an increase in whatever that particular thing is in your community. So they're looking for those causal connections, attributions. If this happens, then this happens. And remember, it's not a promise. It's just a visual to help a funder understand the program. I've had people say, well, I can't promise that, things are going to change in the community. That's why we had at the bottom, you've got those external factors that you can't control. This is not a promise. This is just a visual depiction of your program so that when a funder or a stakeholder or, people that you want to participate in the program have a clear understanding of what the program goals are and how to determine if it's going to be effective. It can't be effective if you have loosey-goosey goals. It can't be effective if you have loosey-goosey objectives. So the logic model is designed to help you strengthen the elements of your program. And here are the basic components of a good logic model. There's only one rule for a logic model, and that is that it's presented on one page. A logic model is never going to be 2 pages, 3 pages, and people are like, well, I have all of these inputs, and that means that you haven't crystallized your message. That means that your program needs more work in terms of the messaging, because a logic model, there's only one rule, and that it's presented on one page. I've had proposals get kicked out because that was the requirement. Like the logic model was like 10 points. And if it was on 2 or 3 pages, boom, because the funder has made the assumption you don't understand your program enough to put it on one page. The other thing is that it's visually engaging. I've had people stuff in 1,000 words in those columns. And I'm like, I can't even read it. So you don't want it to be paragraphs. You want it to be bullets, just training, as opposed to, we will provide adequate training. No, just training. So you want it to be visually engaging. So that means it's not stuffed with a lot of words. It's going to be audience specific. So you can use some of the nomenclature that you would use in your area, because the funder, your stakeholders, are all a part of the sector that you're in. It's going to be appropriate in its level of detail, which I just mentioned before. You're going to have each one of those areas, and it's going to be enough information so that you're comfortable with understanding what goes into that section. At the end of the day, the most important thing are these two things, right? That it's one page and that it is useful in clarifying your program activities and expected outcomes. It should be easy to relate to, and it should reflect the context in which the program operates. But these are the two most important things about your logic model, that it's one page, and that when you look at it and you read it, it helps to clarify what your program activities are and what your expected outcomes are. So just to recap, your logic model is a tool for planning, describing, managing, communicating, and evaluating your program or intervention. You could use this if you're having trouble with determining whether or not an intervention is useful or helpful. That's very minutia, but it would help because you're going to walk through each one of the stages. But it's generally used for a program, right? Because the program's going to have activities, the program's going to have stakeholders and all that. But if you notice, well, I'll tell you this. Most of the logic models that I have and that I receive as a funder, they don't have the situation or the priority section. They just start with the inputs. I am going to encourage you to always include what the problem is, and within what the problem is, so the situation and priorities. So for example, if the issue is graduation, if you're trying to prevent high school dropouts, you put that in your situation. You put graduation rates are low, and then you put who the demographic is, right? It's Black males from urban communities. Because as a funder, as a stakeholder, my orientation is going to be clearer if I know who this is about, right? So people will just start with inputs. Oh, we're going to, get funding, and we're going to get tutors, and we're going to get whatever else you need to reduce, dropouts. But who is it for? What is the problem? So always state what the situation is that you are trying to accomplish, because at the end, when we go down to the impact, how will we know if it's successful if we don't even know what the problem is? So I'm just putting that out there because a lot of the templates out there just have inputs, outputs, outcomes. You need to have the situation and what the priorities are so that a funder, a stakeholder, whoever understands the full picture. Does that make sense? All right, I think that's it. Yeah. So we talked about what the logic model is, the basic elements, and how funders use the logic models in the review process, but also how you can use it to create a more effective program design, because it helps you with clarifying what your goals are, what your objectives are, what the outcomes are, and when it's implemented, it really is very, very helpful. It's very simple. I can't stretch it out longer than that, but I do want to ask if there are any questions. This is your time. We'll use whatever time you want to get clarification or any of that? Anyone? Yes, Mark.
It seems that it has a dual purpose to me.
Mm-hmm.
One, when you lay it out, it's the logic model, and you're drawing a picture for your funder, saying, this is what the problem I'm seeing, this is what I'm going to do, and this is the outcomes I am expecting. But I think that when you look at, say, looking at it 6 months down the road or a year down the road, you could also back up and say, okay, this is my logic model and I'm getting some results, but it's not totally. So it could tell you when you need to go in and revisit
correct.
the model.
Yes, yes, March. Yes. 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 It is a tool that you can use to say, okay, guys, this is what we said in our design, but this is not what's happening, right? And I will tell you, from a reporting perspective, this is perfect for that, because at the end, the funder is going to say, well, what happened? And you can say, yeah, originally in our logic model, we said that, but this down here, external factors, well, we thought that we were going to take our kids to these parks in South Central, but what we learned is that in order to get to these parks, we had to go through 3 gang communities. So we couldn't do that because it put our kids at risk. So we had to divert. And now you have the explanation, because right here, our activities no longer apply because some external factor changed that. But you can look at your logic model and say, well, what happened? What changed? Well, this is what happened. We didn't anticipate having all of these gang territories that we would have to traverse through. And it's going to help you with telling your story. It's going to help you with building out a stronger program. It's going to help you with your reporting. Yes, Marge. Yes. Any other observations? Any other questions? Any other, are you confused on anything? It's a geeky thing. I get geeked out about it. But when I find tools that help me to be more effective, I get geeked out about it. And when it's not presented right, like I told you, I've been in 13 trainings about the logic model, people with PhDs explaining it, and I'm like, I'm not getting it. I'm not getting it. I'm not getting it. And when I get something that simplifies it and makes it make sense, especially because the funder is going to request it, I want to give the funder exactly what they want. I want my proposal to be funded. So if I can figure out a way to give them exactly what they want without creating angst in my heart, I'm excited. So having been a grant writer and knowing that this is a requirement, Richard and I are like, yeah, this is something that we need to talk about, because as BIPOC leaders, not necessarily in academia, understanding the purpose and the function of a logic model is really important in making our proposals competitive. So I'm excited to be able to present it. But that's really all I got. Anything else? Any more questions? All right. Well, in terms of next steps, listen, these webinars are recorded. And if you want to have access to them, then you reach out to Mason at the Latino Coalition. It will give you access to the library of videos that are being recorded. I present them every Thursday from 9 to 10:30. I'm excited about it and I'm here for you. You will receive an evaluation after each one of the webinars. Please fill them out, because I don't want to waste your time. And if you feel like what I'm delivering is not useful, then I'm going to shift. If you like it, that's good. Let us know, because what'll happen is we'll start another cycle. And if the topic is useful, then we will include it. If it's not, then we won't, right? Also, I send out a newsletter every Thursday. It's going to ask you if you'd like to receive the newsletter. If you do, check it. If you don't, it's not a big deal. But I try and send out helpful tips and, you know, things of that nature. But that's it. That's it. Thank you so much for joining me today. You get the gift of time. The topic was just,
I got a quick question for you.
yes. It doesn't even have
Hi,
to be
good
quick.
morning.
You take your time. Go ahead.
Okay. This template here, is that something that you are going to email to us or put in the chat, or will that be, do I need to ask Mason for that?
That's a good question. If you put your email in the chat, I will send you over this template for you.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Can you do that on your phone? Can you? You can do
Yep.
it? Okay, great. Yeah, anybody else, if you want this template, just drop your email into the chat and I will send it over to you. Yay.
Thank you.
All right, you guys have a wonderful rest of your Thursday. Thank you for joining me. I hope to see you next Thursday. Mindy, it was so good to see you.
Oh, thank you. I am so excited about this. Thank you so much. This clarified so much in my mind.
Yay.
I appreciate it.
I
Have a
appreciate
good one.
You too.
Amazing as always.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Have a great day.
You too.